All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a guy whose face is literally in almost everyone's wallet, yet whose actual, real-life humanity has been completely buried under, what, 2 centuries of myth? We're going to look way beyond those stoic marble statues to uncover the true George Washington. And as you'll see, we're looking at a man whose absolute defining characteristic, the very thing that changed the entire course of history, was his extraordinary ability to just surrender absolute power.
But before we get into all the grueling battles and the massive burdens of the presidency, let me ask you a quick question. We usually think of the father of the country as this incredibly serious, unsmiling general, right? But did you know he had a genuinely surprising favorite hobby? One that might actually completely shatter your whole perception of him? I mean, despite the literal weight of the world on his shoulders, George Washington was a highly relatable human being who absolutely loved to dance. People who actually knew him at the time noted that for all the incredibly serious things he did for the country, he genuinely loved going out to parties and spending hours on the dance floor. His natural athleticism translated into just incredible grace.
Section 1. The Making of Washington.
So Washington definitely wasn't born a revered leader. Actually, following the early death of his father, his formal education ended before he was even 12 years old. With no Latin, no Greek, and really none of the classical training of his wealthy peers, he worked as a land surveyor out in the rugged Virginia backcountry, and this experience inadvertently set him on a collision course with a pretty turbulent military career. Now, you might assume that career kicked off with glorious victories. Well, it didn't. He learned through brutal, humiliating setbacks during the French and Indian War. Like in 1753, he barely survived a freezing wilderness mission to deliver an ultimatum. Then in 1754, at Fort Necessity, he was surrounded in the mud and actually tricked into signing a surrender document in French, a language he couldn't even read, that falsely confessed to the assassination of a French officer. And then, in 1755, he rode right into a massacre. But he managed to salvage his reputation during that 1755 massacre, which became known as Braddock's defeat. The British regulars were just slaughtered in a chaotic ambush, but Washington rode back and forth through the killing zone, trying to rally the men. Just think about this for a second. He had 2 horses shot right out from under him, and 4 bullet holes literally pierced his coat. Yet somehow, he escaped completely uninjured and managed to organize the chaotic retreat. That incredible physical courage basically transformed him overnight, from a failed colonial officer into a recognized military hero. Section 2. The Revolutionary Commander. Fast forward 2 decades, and the American colonies are at war with Britain. When the Continental Congress nominated Washington as commander-in-chief, he actually fled the room. He genuinely doubted he was equal to the command. He reluctantly accepted the gig and even refused to take a salary. And to really grasp the sheer scale of the nightmare he inherited, you have to consider this staggering disparity. In the defense of New York, Washington's 19,000 poorly equipped, untrained, and frankly demoralized volunteers faced off against the greatest military machine on Earth, 32,000 professional British troops backed by 400 ships. It was a tactical disaster. Washington was repeatedly outflanked and literally chased all the way across New Jersey, with his army disintegrating along the way. So what does this 9 hours mean? Well, by Christmas 1776, the revolution was on the absolute verge of total collapse. To save it, Washington orchestrated a desperate, incredibly audacious plan to cross the ice-choked Delaware River in the dead of a freezing blizzard. He thought it would take a few hours. Instead, it took 9 agonizing hours of battling ice and sleet. But they made it. They surprised the Hessian forces at Trenton and completely turned the psychological tide of the whole war. The absolutely crucial point here is that Washington realized he couldn't win a traditional European-style war. His grand strategy essentially became one of sheer endurance. Step 1 was just retreat whenever threatened, purely to keep the army alive. Step 2, endure unimaginable suffering, like the starvation and disease at Valley Forge, without breaking. And finally, Step 3, wait for the absolute perfect moment, along with French naval support, to march 450 miles south and trap the British forces at Yorktown, forcing the final surrender. Section 3. The Ultimate Surrender. Now, you'd probably assume Yorktown was the grand climax of his life, but his most defining moment, the one that truly shaped the United States, actually happened right as the Revolutionary War was drawing to a close. While waiting for the final peace treaty in March 1783, the Continental Army was camped in Newburgh, New York, and the men were furious. They hadn't been paid by Congress in months, sometimes years. These desperate officers were planning a military coup to overthrow the civilian government. The fate of the young republic was literally teetering on the brink of total collapse. So Washington unexpectedly walks into their meeting to stop the mutiny, but his written speech just wasn't swaying their anger. Actually, scratched that. It was failing. But then he fumbles in his coat, pulls out a brand new pair of reading glasses, and says, "You will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country." That single, incredibly vulnerable gesture reminded these hardened officers of the brutal sacrifices they had all shared together. It moved them to tears, and the coup collapsed instantly. And then he did the unthinkable. In December 1783, Washington stunned the entire world by voluntarily resigning his military commission. He walked into Congress, literally handed back his power, and just went home to his farm at Mount Vernon. I mean, every precedent in human history dictated that victorious generals seize dictatorial power. When King George III heard Washington was just going to walk away, he famously declared that if he did that, he would be the greatest man in the world. Section 4. The Reluctant President. Of course, the country couldn't just leave him alone on his farm. He was pulled out of retirement as the young government struggled, presided over the Constitutional Convention in 1787, and ended up in a role he absolutely dreaded. I mean, look at this number, 100%. When the first presidential election was held, George Washington won unanimously. He captured every single electoral college vote. To this day, it's the only unanimous presidential election in American history. He accepted the job with a super heavy heart, even writing to a friend that he felt like a culprit going to the place of his execution. Washington basically had to invent the presidency from absolute scratch. There was zero rule book. He established vital precedents that ensured the office wouldn't just function like a monarchy. He created a cabinet of advisors. He kept the fragile new nation out of a disastrous European war through his 1793 proclamation of neutrality. And most importantly, he voluntarily stepped down after 2 terms, setting up a tradition for the peaceful transfer of power that has held strong for over 2 centuries. Section 5. The Final Legacy. After finally leaving the presidency, Washington went back to Mount Vernon. His death in 1799 was sudden and, honestly, pretty medically gruesome. After riding around his farm in the freezing rain, he developed acute bacterial epiglottitis, which is a really severe throat infection. But the treatment was arguably way worse than the disease. Following the medical standards they had at the time, his doctors bled him, removing an astonishing 80 ounces of his blood. To put that into perspective, that's about 40% of his total blood volume. This massive blood loss induced shock, fatally worsened his condition, and directly led to his death on December 14th. Now, any honest explainer of Washington's legacy has to neutrally examine its profound contradictions. The ideal we often hear is that he fought a revolution for human liberty and equality, but the reality is that he built his immense wealth relying entirely on enslaved labor. While he did privately express a desire to see slavery abolished, he only freed the 123 slaves he personally owned in his will, and even then only upon his wife's death. The remaining enslaved people at Mount Vernon who were owned by his wife's estate were not freed. It is a very complex reality of a man deeply entrenched in the systems of his specific time. When news of his passing finally spread, the entire nation went into deep mourning. His former cavalry commander, Henry Lee, delivered a famous eulogy stating he was first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. That one phrase forever cemented Washington's central, undeniable place in the American identity. Which leaves us with a final, pretty provocative thought to ponder today. As you reflect on the actual man behind the marble, the young surveyor, the failed colonial officer, the guy who loved to dance, the reluctant general, and the dreaded presidency, ask yourself this. Was Washington's greatest legacy the immense power he gathered? Or was it his entirely unprecedented willingness to just give it all away? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning everything, and I'll catch you on the next one.